audiobook sorted to listen to.
This is Audible.
Harper Audio presents Member of the Family, my story of Charles Manson, life inside his cult, and the darkness that ended the 60s, by Diane Lake and Deborah Herman. This is Diane Lake. To the victims and their families, those who needlessly lost their lives and those who continue to suffer because of the madness of this dark time in our shared history. May God's grace prevail and heal the pain that remains. Author's note. It's time for me to exorcise my own demons and to face the truth as much as I can remember it. In this audiobook, I have shared what I can recreate through straining my memory muscle, research, corroboration from people who knew me, and my own words from trial and interrogation transcripts. They tell only my piece of the story from personal experience and perception. I was with the Manson family from the age of 14 until my arrest at Barker Ranch at the age of 16. My memories by necessity reflect the mind of a teenager. Everything in this audiobook is true. Some of the names and identifying details have been changed to protect people's privacy. Some conversations are recreated to the best of my ability, as no memory is perfect. This is my perspective. This is my story, and this is my confessional. Prologue, 2008. It began, as these stories often do, with a phone call, one that I had been dreading for decades. "Are you Diane Lake?" the voice asked. The question stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't heard that name for years. This could be about only one thing. I said hesitantly. "What do you want?" Immediately after the words left my mouth, I regretted saying them. I'd done nothing wrong, committed no crimes, but I had a reason to hide. So many people out there had looked for me over the years. Reporters writing about the crimes, journalists seeking sources for books about the family, and of course the worst were the crazies obsessed with Charles Manson. For the most part, I'd been able to evade them all, flying under the radar all these years, hiding in plain sight with my husband's last name. I immediately wished I had hung up the phone right at that moment, but it happened too fast. My answer, a reflex. Even after all these years, I still wasn't prepared. I had buried my history so well, I'd almost forgotten that once I was someone else, a young girl named Diane Lake, who was only 14 when Charles Manson had inducted her into his family of followers. A girl who had spent almost 2 years being manipulated by him before a moment of clarity broke the spell, and who then went on to testify against him on November 3rd, 1970, helping to put him in prison forever. Over the course of the 8 years that followed, I'd been in and out of the courtroom through the Manson trial and 2 retrials of fellow family member Leslie Van Houten, coming of age on the witness stand and telling my story to the juries and the judges, as well as to the gawkers who obsessed over the gruesome acts that were committed by Charles Manson and the members of his family on 2 nights in August 1969. I told stories of life with the family, of the things we'd done and the drugs we'd taken, of how I joined with the blessing of my parents, hippies themselves, thinking that I was in control of my life, only to discover a reality darker than I ever could have imagined. And in 1978, after my final appearance on the witness stand for Leslie Van Houten's retrial, I put away these stories of Charles Manson and the family and left them behind for good. In a case that had captured the attention of people around the world, where spectators waited all night for one of the 15 seats in the courtroom, I was the last witness. From then on, Charles Manson and his family were a part of my past. They had nothing to do with my present or my future. By that point, I was already being courted by my husband, with whom I spent the next 35 years. He knew about my past, but we decided to create a life without ties to that former identity. We never told his family or the 3 children we went on to have together about what I'd been through. Even when when my daughter brought in a stray cat and named it Charlie, I never acknowledged why I suggested she call him something else. Over time, my memories of the Manson family became watercolors, the lines soft and blurry without clear definition. Whenever I was reminded of the family, either because of events in the news or anniversary retrospectives, I disconnected, all too willing to forget the events of my own life, until the phone rang. "I'm Paul Dosty," the voice said. "I'm a detective, and my partner is a cadaver dog named Buster." "What is this about?" I asked. "I know that you told investigator Jack Gardner that you thought there were more bodies buried up by Barker Ranch." Barker Ranch. It was where we'd hidden out after the murders, in Death Valley, the middle of nowhere, and as far away as Charlie could take us. A place where they weren't supposed to find us, only they did. 2 months after the killings, with a warrant for an unrelated charge of vandalism, the police raided Barker Ranch, rounding up all of us. In the interim, it was family member Susan Atkins, one of the killers, then in jail on another charge, who made the connection between these crimes and Charlie. I kept my identity secret as I shared a cell with the other girls in the family. When it came time to testify before the grand jury, I admitted my real age of only 16 and gave them my true name. Confessing my true age made me a ward of the court and landed me in a mental institution. An interesting twist for a teenage girl who'd experienced all that the counterculture of the 1960s had to offer. Jack Gardner, the cop who had been my arresting officer, must have seen something in me worth saving, because when I was institutionalized, he began visiting me there. When it was time for me to be released, he and his wife took me in as a foster child. They were the first people who helped me feel safe enough to speak about what I'd been through, what I'd seen and heard. I lived securely with them until I testified. As I cradled the phone in my hand, I strained to recall what I might have said to Jack all those years ago. Maybe I had told him there were other bodies. There could have been. People would often come and go from the Barker Ranch, disappearing at random. Maybe they were passing through, or maybe something more sinister happened to them. Charlie and the others were obviously capable of murder. Diane, there are people who may never have been brought to justice. My dog is alerted to some possible human remains. I didn't respond. While in the moment, I couldn't be sure if he was telling the truth. I'd later learn this was indeed the case. In February of 2008, a team of investigators, including former Inyo County Detective John Little, who had worked for Jack in the early 1970s, went with Dosty and others to see if they could find anything at the old Barker Ranch. Do you know that Under Sheriff Jack Gardner back in 1974 sent Detective Little to Barker to investigate possible human remains buried there? He was your foster father during the trial. Now, why would he do that if he had nothing to base it upon? My hands began to sweat. For the first time in many years, Charlie's face appeared in my mind along with the words, "Don't talk to no one in authority." I felt as though I was going into a tunnel and I could hear the small voice of my 16-year-old self somewhere in the distance. "What do you want with me, Mr. Dawson?" I don't remember anything I might have said to Jack back then. "I'm calling you out of courtesy. We're going back there today, and we are going to tape it and show it on television. If anything is discovered out there, we are going to have to trace it back to tip-offs you likely gave to Jack Gardner." "Please, I'm not that person anymore," I said. "I have a family and children. I go to church. I sing in the choir. I teach autistic children, for heaven's sake. My children don't know anything about my past." "That is why I'm giving you a heads up," he said coolly. "I know you were not a killer, but you were part of something bigger than you are. And it is news and it is history. I think we are going to find things out there that are going to be gruesome. It's up to you how you want to handle this with your family. Can't you just get me out of this?" "I am sorry, Diane, but from what I have read, you became a part of it the second you got on that bus with Charlie Manson." That night I told my husband about the call. We both knew this day would come. It had to. It was a terrible secret to keep from my children, but I knew that I couldn't bring myself to tell them any other way. I buried the past too carefully. Nothing about their upbringing would suggest what I'd hidden. For most of my children's lives, I had the privilege of being home with them, taking care of them. We lived modestly, but well, and I made sure the house was clean, dinner was on the table, and I was in the front row at every school function. My children never spent a day thinking I was not there for them. But now the front was going to collapse under the weight of my former life and the shame I'd concealed for years. Now I would have to tell my children what had really happened during those 2 treacherous years in California. But first I myself would have to face the truth. Memories fade, trauma remembers. It is stored in your body, your senses, your synapses, and cells. It would take strength to tell my story, but more importantly, it would take strength to tell myself and to remember. Part 1, Turn On. Chapter 1, A Minnesota Childhood. This is how my real story begins, not with sunny Southern California, hippies and drugs, but as white bread and middle class as it gets, 1950s Minnesota. Born in 1953, I was my parents' first child. My father, Clarence, was a sturdy man with a wide, crooked smile. He followed his father's footsteps into the house painting trade to put the food on the table, but art was his passion. He began art school after his marriage, using painting as an outlet for his creativity. House painter by day, artist by night. My mom, Shirley, was a housewife who made every effort to look her best each day and keep a lovely home. As a little girl, I would follow her around the house and try to imitate everything she did. If she was washing a dish in the sink, I would beg to be picked up. I do it, I would squeal until she gave me my own sponge to wash with. I was her little shadow and became a mini mama when my brother Danny and then later my sister Kathy were born. When I was in first grade, my parents must have felt prosperous enough to buy a sizable house outside Minneapolis with a huge backyard. Our neighbors had a greenhouse in which they grew all kinds of fragrant flowers. When you opened the door, you were greeted with the smell of potted perennials, herbs, and colorful annual flowers for every season. I kept an eye on my younger brother and sister while my father worked and my mother took care of the house. Kathy was a baby, so I would wheel her in her stroller across the lawn and carry her in my arms so she could smell the blooms. My mother continued to let me help around the house, and in many ways, the housework was exciting to me. There were new household gadgets available, and we had a top-of-the-line Hoover Constellation, a round, space-age-looking vacuum that was supposed to float on its own exhaust. You almost wanted to throw dirt on the floor just so you could see how it worked. Our home was always clean, but sometimes I vacuumed just to have something to do. My mom taught me how to sew on this toy sewing machine I got one year for Christmas, setting me up at a table next to her Singer sewing machine, showing me how to thread the needle and guide the fabric to make the stitches stay straight. In the weeks that followed, she gave me scraps of fabric so I could create outfits for my dolls and little quilts. Eventually, I got so good at this that she got me a pattern so I could sew clothes for myself. From the outside, ours was a traditional family, but there was a restlessness beneath the surface. Before I was born, my father had served in the Korean conflict, and although I wouldn't have known the difference, my mother said he had changed. A father's dissatisfaction is not always expressed out loud, but it is certainly felt. Over time, I came to understand how the currents of his behavior affected our family life. After coming home from work, he would disappear into the corner of the living room that he had set aside for painting. We weren't allowed to go near him when he was working. We had our own playroom, and whenever Danny and Kathy tried to bother him, I would catch them so he wouldn't be disturbed. Even at that age, I understood that he needed room to create. Even young as I was, I sensed that there was a distance to him, a detachment that made him different. When he smiled, the sun would shine, and my earliest memories are of him laughing and playing with me. But when he was depressed, it was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. He was sullen unless he was working on a project. On those sad days, he would sit quietly in a dark room, staring off into space, smoking cigarette after cigarette, the smoke thick in the air around him. I must have taken my cues from my mother because she largely allowed him the space to indulge his whims. Despite his moodiness, he could do no wrong in her eyes. She interacted with him in a manner that bordered on worship and defined much of our domestic lives. She watched him closely, gauging his expressions before she would interact with him. When he got home from work, she would wait until he settled in before beginning any conversation. She wouldn't present him with our misdeeds the minute he walked in the door. Instead, we were instructed to greet him cheerfully. He was the stoic king of our castle, and we learned to wait until he addressed us before sharing too much with him. I wanted him to notice me, and if he did, I held on to the moment in my heart and in my memory. My remembrances of the times he would grumble, tease me about something that would make me feel bad, or tell me, "I'll give you something to cry about," would be countered by his moments of playfulness, even if they were not directed at me. Perhaps because of my father's unpredictability, my mother controlled the money in the house, as she was the more responsible person. At the end of the week, my father handed her whatever money he'd earned painting houses, and I would watch as she paid all the bills. Each month, my mom would make sure that the mortgage on the house was paid along with every other bill, spreading the envelopes on the table, writing out checks, and asking me to lick the stamps. Then she would take them to the post office in town to mail them. Each week, she would give my father an allowance in cash and set aside our money for food. She did all the shopping for us and prepared all our needs. She would pack his lunch in the morning, sometimes putting a little note in his brown bag. She also made dinner every night. Although my dad always seemed busy, he did take time to have dinner with us. This was my favorite time of day because he led the discussion and included me just as if I were a grown-up. "Diane, what are you learning in school?" he'd ask me. "Be right back," I'd reply, running off to gather a stack of papers. "Look, Daddy, I got good grades on this." I'd spread out my spelling tests, writing practice books and math papers, showing him my schoolwork and my achievements and trying to impress him. "That's great. Keep up the good work." At dinner, my father would often bring up the books he was reading, eager to discuss them with my mother and always somehow disappointed that she didn't share his interest in them. For my part, I was excited in anything that interested him. "I'm reading a great book, Shirley. I think you should read it too," he said one night while we were eating. "You know I don't have that much time to read," my mother responded. "What's it about, Daddy?" I asked. "I can read now." I was in the top reading group in my class. "Oh, honey, I think this is a little too old for you," he said, "but I will tell you about it. It's by this guy named Jack Kerouac, and it's about two friends who go on this road trip to find out more about themselves." "Read it to me." I liked hearing my father's voice, whether he was reading me Horton Hatch's The Egg, which I could now read myself, or if he read to me from his own books that I didn't really understand. "Well, actually, I just got another book by Jack Kerouac," he said, getting up from the table and reaching into the pocket of his jacket, which was hanging on a hook by the door. The book cover had funny writing and a man with a woman riding on him piggyback. "This book is called The Dharma Bums," he informed me. Here is something he says in the book. "One man practicing kindness in the wilderness is worth all the temples this world pulls." I like that, Daddy. I had no idea what it meant, but I liked that it had the word kindness in it. It must have been something good. I gave my daddy a hug and he left the table to continue working on a painting. Another night after dinner, he had retreated to the living room to paint when he noticed I was sitting outside the room. I didn't want to disturb him, but wanted to watch him work. "Hey, little girl, do you like this music?" he asked suddenly. We had a small record player, and while he painted, he usually would play something from his collection. "What is that?" I'd never heard sounds like the ones coming from the record. There wasn't really any singing, just music. "It's jazz," he replied. "Isn't it cool?" My dad showed me the album cover. It was wild. Then he took out another record and showed me how to carefully clamp an album between my hands by the edges so it wouldn't get scratched. He used a black brush on the record surface before he put it on the record player, placing the needle delicately on the first groove and inviting me to sit down with him. We sat on a love seat next to his easel. I watched as the smoke rose from a cigarette, curling its way toward the ceiling. Every so often he would blow a smoke ring just to get me to laugh. Listen to this part. Ba, 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 he sang along with the trumpet. After a while, we were both bobbing our heads up and down in time to the beat. The music changed with each instrument. I liked the timpani and the cymbals. I had never heard anything like them. Diane, that is Buddy Rich. He is arguably the best drummer in history. Now I was rocking back and forth. After a while, my eyelids got heavy. The last thing I remembered were the sounds of a trumpet. In the morning, I woke up in my bed, the beat still ringing in my ears. One morning during the early months of my second grade year, I was in the kitchen with my mother when my father walked in. Do you want some coffee? I brewed a fresh pot, my mom said, apron tied around her waist. Sure, honey, he replied, and then, as if it was part of an ongoing discussion, he said, too bad we don't live in California. Do you know they get to listen to jazz all the time? I thought if you want to talk about jazz, the scene is in New York, she asked. There is a happening scene for artists and poets in Venice Beach, California. I read about this place called the Gas House. Everyone goes there, including Jack Kerouac. They opened it last year, and it's an exciting place for artists to get started. I could get my master's degree out there and get somewhere. I could see my mother's body tense as she went about making breakfast for him. Her fingers tightly gripped the handle of the pan as she scraped his eggs onto his plate. Look, we have a nice house here, and the kids are all settled, my mother said. It's hard enough to take care of 3 kids, a house, and a husband. Can't you do your master's here? My dad relented, and the conversation petered out. He continued working as a house painter during the day, keeping his desire for a change of scenery mostly to himself. While I never knew exactly what he was thinking, it was clear there were things about our life, about his life, that were not satisfying him. Still, beyond my mother, he really had no one he could talk to about this desire to break from the mold of his life that was gradually hardening around him. He couldn't tell his father about how he felt. Grandpa's reply would have been, else can you put food in your mouth and kept you alive? Do you think you are better than me? My father remained largely silent on the matter, but none of this eased his malaise. It's hard to say exactly what impact he had on him, but there's no doubt that it influenced him and enhanced his impatience. It's jazz music. These were the first sounds of the underground reverberating out from the coast toward Middle America and making men like my father question the choices they'd made. The tipping point came from something that seemed innocent enough. Somewhat impulsively, my father ordered a hi-fi, a high-fidelity stereo system, by mail. He couldn't wait to get the thing. He thought it was going to fill the entire house with sound. In contrast to the phonograph, music from which barely carried into the next room. But when the hi-fi arrived, he looked at the bill, apparently for the first time, and freaked out at the cost. Shortly after that, he broke from their usual pattern of letting my mother handle the finances, and instead sat down with her while she was writing out the bills. He turned them over and read them one at a time, eventually stopping at the mortgage bill. As he stared at it, he figured out the interest on the mortgage, becoming more and more upset. Perhaps the mortgage became a symbol of his frustration with our situation. The perpetual responsibility, the way it tied us down in Minnesota, and the fact that our house and family would apparently be his life's work. All of it seemed to weigh on him. How the hell are we going to keep up with these payments? He shouted at my mother, who was surprised that he had suddenly started caring about the money they spent. His response might also have had something to do with the books he was reading, because he was telling her that they were being pulled into, as he put it, the establishment trap of materialism. This house and this stuff is going to steal our soul. He slammed the bill on the table and knocked the other papers on the floor. It was your idea to get the hi-fi, Mom shouted back. It was not really a shout so much as a mix of utter surprise and confusion. She never raised her voice to him, because to her, he was always right. But his reaction was puzzling, even for her. She had never wanted the hi-fi in the first place. He wanted to play his music. as well as records by people he had been reading about, like Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg. He wanted her to spend time with him listening to them, but she always had her hands full and only feigned interest. This debate over our mortgage and our stuff went on. My father held fast the idea that the house was a problem for us, refusing to let it go. And in the end, he impressed my mother with what she believed was his sincerity about materialism. What my father really wanted, and which we'd seen glimpses of already, was to move further, to get his master's degree, teach art, and paint. California was where it was happening, and that was where he wanted to be. My parents put the house on the market, and instead of a realtor or an actual buyer, one of the neighbors approached them about the house. My father was being very impulsive and wanted to get out from under the stress of the mortgage, so when they offered their travel house trailer as a trade, he and my mother agreed it was a clever idea. That was that. It wasn't even considered a down payment. They simply traded this lovely home with a big lawn, room to play, and a greenhouse next door on a handshake and a whim. Like many decisions made during those years, my parents just did it, and that was that. It all happened quickly, and before the end of a year that had started out calmly enough, before Christmas of the year I was in second grade, we gave away most of our things, took what we could, like my toy sewing machine, and packed the trailer. We didn't even have anyone to tell that we were leaving. We didn't have family in the area, and I just had my teachers and friends from school. My mom even had to leave her own sewing machine behind. On the day we moved, they hitched up the trailer to our car, and we all got in, resigned to the fact that we would be headed west to California, into the new life my father craved, setting out for the promised land of California like pioneers in a wagon train. Except that's not what happened. As we drove away, the car kept stalling. My father finally pulled over to the side of the road and got out. We stayed in the car, huddled together against the Minnesota wind, which penetrated fiercely through the windows. In the back seat, I held baby Kathy close to my chest to keep her calm as I watched my father jiggle things under the hood of the car. My mother was already sobbing and mumbling about how she would miss her sewing machine. She vested all her regrets on the one thing she couldn't bear to leave behind. My father was cursing and stomping around, chain smoking. I didn't typically see my father this angry. Usually he would withdraw rather than yell. There were times when he was drunk, when he would lose his temper, and I saw him hit my mother a few times. But this felt different. It was scary to watch as he unraveled. Clearly, he was upset about more than an aborted trip to California. With this useless trailer came a useless dream and more disappointment than he was ready to accept. As my mother continued to cry, I wished that I could calm her, but I had the baby asleep in my arms. Meanwhile, Danny was surprisingly relaxed considering the histrionics happening all around us. My father saw her crying and yelled at her to stop blubbering, which only made her cry even louder. At this point, I think she was just exasperated. Everything was happening so fast, and she hated to be so out of control. My parents eventually figured out that we weren't going to be taking this trailer to California and found someone to tow us to the nearest trailer park, which was in a suburb south of Minneapolis called Burnside. Mostly dirt and mud, the trailer park was not really set up for permanent living. We stayed where we landed, next to a few other trailers that must have met the same fate. About 23 feet long and without many amenities, our trailer was not set up for such permanent living either. The five of us learned to squeeze into the small space my father still chain smoking in our tin can home. The trailer had a galley kitchen and a living room where we put the baby's crib. Danny and I had bunk beds in the back of the trailer, and my mom and dad had their own little room. We had a small living room area where we could play games at night and do homework. We had a potbelly stove at the entrance to the trailer on which I could easily iron my hair ribbons. All I had to do was run them along the heated top, and they came out wrinkle-free. We all did our best to settle into Burnside. My brother and I were enrolled at a funky little country school and had to take a bus, where I spent the second half of second grade and the first half of third grade. I got used to the situation, but my mom still missed her sewing machine. She never mentioned the house and her stove, but we all knew that she missed them as well. The impulsive trading of our house had been done with a handshake, and since we were not that far away, one day my parents went back for some of the belongings they left behind. But when they arrived, no one was home. The new owners were not just out for the day. It appeared they hadn't been living there for a while. There were no belongings to reclaim, no house to trade back, and my parents had no one to blame but themselves. It wouldn't be the last time my parents' idealism was betrayed by reality, or the placing of trust in the wrong people. But that didn't mean they learned from it. We lived in the trailer park until my father found a patron of the arts to support his painting. He had been searching for someone to believe in his art for quite a while, so meeting this wealthy, art-loving couple was the break he had been waiting for. They owned a gallery and asked my father to provide them with some paintings. When they found out about our living situation, they invited him to become a regular artist with them. They loved his style and couldn't stand that my father was an artist without a studio or a proper home. The arrangement would be that he would provide them a certain number of canvases for the gallery to sell, and he could work on other projects if they did not conflict. Even more generously, this new couple set my father up with his own studio where he could paint and create, and placed us in a small house with a nice yard where we could live more comfortably. Kind as these actions were, they were also part of the patron's role. Gallery owners were supposed to take diligent care of their artists. When word spread of their generosity, other artists would be enticed into joining their stable. All of us loved our new little house, and once again it felt like home. But more important, it felt like home to my father, a place where he could pursue his art to his content. Gradually, his fixation with moving to California abated, and life returned to some sort of normal, at least for a time. Chapter 2. Family Matters. With my dad occupied painting for his patrons, our family settled into a routine of sorts, and he threw himself into his work. He spent the days in his studio, which was filled with supplies, canvases, and a drafting table. It smelled like a combination of linseed oil, India ink, cigarette smoke, and creativity. He smiled and listened to jazz records while he worked. Christmas Day, during my third grade year when we lived in this little house, was the best time I can remember ever having with my entire family. That morning, I awoke to the smell of fresh cinnamon buns that my mother had made from scratch and raced downstairs to see what was under the tree. Beside the presents from Grandma, Grandpa, and my parents that had been under the tree the night before, there was a new one. There it was in all its glory, the Barbie dream house I had wanted. A gift from Santa Claus. I ripped through my other presents, opening gifts from my father's parents from Milwaukee. Our only close family, they would be visiting us in the summer now that we were settled into a proper home. Finally, I got to a present that was marked, "To Diane from Dad." I tore into the package and couldn't believe what was in it. My father had made a bed for my Barbie to fit into the house that Santa had sent me. On the verge of tears with excitement, I went to hug my dad, always a bit awkward at affection. He turned away, giving me a sideways hug. Later that day, we had Christmas dinner with some of my parents' friends. My parents had settled into our new home, our new life, and had added new people. My father had collected a new crowd matching the life he was creating and his new persona as a professional artist. Around the table this year was an Ethiopian artist who wore a dashiki. The dark-skinned man chewed on 2 pieces of orange sticks and used them to clean his teeth. He told us about how in his country they did not use forks and knives when they ate. Instead, he explained, they used a special bread to scoop food into their mouths and into the mouths of others sharing the table. This Christmas meal would be strictly American, and he was looking forward to our traditions. My parents were also friends with a Ukrainian couple who joined us. They brought us pisanki as a gift and explained they were typically for Easter. These were eggs decorated with Ukrainian folk designs. The wife promised to show me how the eggs were created during the holiday. It was a remarkably special day, but sadly, it was also one of the last of its kind. We never were that happy and secure again in Minnesota. Things always had a way of changing, especially in a family like mine. My parents seemed content with their friends, but my mother encouraged us to keep in touch with my father's parents as well. Sometimes I would hear them arguing about having them come visit us, with my mother insisting it was good for children to know their family, and my father saying he didn't need to see his parents. During the summer between 1st and 2nd grade, my grandparents had come out to visit us back in our big old house. It was a fun visit, and I've enjoyed having them around, eating meals together and going places. I was proud when during dinner time one evening my father hung a portrait he had painted of me on the wall for everyone to see. My dad and Grandpa worked on the car together, and we all seemed to get along. Still, in the aftermath of the visit, there seemed to be some residual tension between Grandpa and my father. It was obvious that my grandparents didn't share my father's interests, and that Grandpa in particular never liked my father's desire to be with us, looking down on him for it. The following summer, we didn't see my grandparents, and I don't think my parents ever let them know that we had been living in a trailer park. But now that we were back in a real house and my father was becoming successful, my mother began encouraging him to contact me. The children miss their grandparents, Clarence. We should invite them out. I'm too busy to take the time with them. Besides, I'm finally enjoying myself, he said. Father and son exasperated each other, which made it difficult for the 2 wives, who made it their mission to keep their husbands happy. Any tension that could not be relieved by copious amounts of beer would have repercussions for both women after dark. Your mother called and really wants to see Diane. She said she'll be all grown up before you know it. Your father agrees. Well then, maybe she could go to see them, he suggested. By herself? Mom asked, not so sure she should allow my unsupervised independence. She had grown to love her mother-in-law, who had become something of a Rosetta Stone to help her understand her son. But she still had reservations about sending her daughter so far away on the train. She'll be fine, and we can have a break from at least one child for a few weeks, and it will get them off our backs for a while. And so, in the summer of 1962, when I was 9 years old, my parents made plans for my visit to Wisconsin. When my parents told me I would be visiting my grandparents in Milwaukee, I wasn't even scared of being by myself, just excited to have all the attention without my brother and sister being around all the time. I planned everything out. The first things I carefully packed were my Barbie and Ken dolls, along with the clothing I had sewn for them. I didn't want to go on this adventure without them. Like me, my Barbie had red hair that she wore in a bouffant hairdo. I wrapped her hair in tissue so it wouldn't get mussed during the long train ride. I dressed Ken in a makeshift suit so he would be properly attired for the visit. I also packed some of my favorite books, National Velvet and Nancy Drew, my hairbrush, and some Max Factor lip gloss my mom let me buy. It was shiny but tasteless, and it made me feel beautiful. Mom helped me carefully fold my clothes, as well as some pink clip curlers for my hair, a robe, and a pair of pink fluffy slippers. When I got to Milwaukee, my grandma and grandpa met me at the station. "You've gotten so big," Grandma said. "You look so grown up since we saw you last." It had been 2 years, and I had been more like a baby during their last visit. Grandma pulled me into a hug against her soft chest. She smelled of a combination of lilac powder and beer. Grandpa patted me on the head and grabbed my bag. He was about the same height and size as Grandma, but his arms were much stronger. The years of house painting had preserved a muscularity more common in a younger man. Now they owned an apartment building together, and he did all the maintenance, while Grandma collected the rent and kept the tenants happy. When we got to the building, they gave me my own room across from theirs, and Grandma helped me unpack. We put my Barbie, Ken, and books on the oak highboy next to the bed that they said used to belong to my dad. Then we carefully placed my folded clothes in the now empty drawers. I thought about my dad's clothes in those same drawers when he was a little boy. Sitting on the highboy was a framed picture of Grandpa and me, taken during their last visit. When we got settled, Grandpa and Grandma took me right across the street to a bar. "Hey, Dutch," Grandpa said, "2 brews for us and a Shirley Temple for our little Shirley Temple." I liked that they were showing me off. This would not be the only time that they took me to the local bars. They liked their beer, and I liked my Shirley Temples. The room was smoky and dark, but I liked that they let me be in there with the grown-ups. The later it got, the louder they got. Then we walked home, and Grandma helped Grandpa into bed. That first night, after I had gone to bed, I heard Grandpa rustling around in the kitchen. I found him by himself at the small dinette with a glass of milk and a box of graham crackers. He crumbled the graham crackers into the milk until it was thick as pudding. "You want some, little girl?" It looked lumpy, but I was happy he was offering me some of his snack. "Sure. Get a glass and I'll show you how it's done." I poured some milk from the bottle in the Frigidaire and grabbed 2 graham crackers. "You gotta have just the right number of crackers to make it good," he explained. It seemed like a delicate operation, but I got it right the first time. "You're a natural," he said. We spent the next 20 minutes in silence as we slurped down our graham cracker mush. "You ought to get back to bed. We're taking you to the zoo tomorrow." I was so excited to go that I didn't even plead to stay up later with him. I shuffled away in my pink shag slippers and went right to sleep. The zoo was everything I'd hoped it would be, and I spent the next few days after that with Grandma, going to an elderly neighbor's apartment to check on her and taking a trip to the salon, where I got a rather unfortunate perm. One morning at breakfast, Grandma told me that this day would be a bit different. "You're going to spend the day with Grandpa today," she said, giving me a hug. "Be good and do what he says. I have some shopping and errands to do. I will be back for supper." I was eager to spend the day with my grandpa, watching TV, reading the funny papers, and crumbling graham crackers into our milk. We sat together on the couch for a while, and I leaned my head on his shoulder. We were watching a Western. It was such a treat to watch a television that I didn't mind that it turned out to be old Zorro reruns. Grandpa smelled like cutting grass. He wore a kind of aftershave called something like Old Bay rum. I could have stayed like that for hours. I have an idea for what we can do together, Grandpa broke the silence. What's that, Grandpa? I replied excitedly. Do you want to play Parcheesi? We had been having a running competition. Let's take a bath together. A bath?